I want to talk a little bit more about shiny, happy people and episode 2, but I'm also going to reference some stuff from episode 1. So the first thing I appreciated with episode 2 is that they gave some time to talk to Tia Levings, and she's somebody I've followed on social media for quite some time, so it was really good to hear what she had to say, because she joined fundamentalism as a young wife. And I think it's super important to recognize that a key factor in why so many people are willing to be led by IBLP, by Bill Gothard, by fundamentalist churches is this vulnerability. And there's this, with the destruction of deep communities that have lived together all their lives. I grew up in that kind of an environment. I grew up in a country, I grew up in Jamaica, and I was in a very country setting where people knew each other their whole lives. They really, and many of them had, married different people in the area. Like, many of them were related to each other. Outsiders just weren't really a regular occurrence. But the advantage of that is that if you are a young parent, you have a huge resource bed of people who you can go to get help in marriage problems, in parenting problems, in just about any area of life. You already know all of these people. You know some of their stories because you've lived there for so long. And so you can have the wisdom of other people and also see how that wisdom played out in their own life, so you know who you want to listen to. And fundamentalism promises this kind of resource. And so if you're a young parent, especially a young adult, who's looking for direction, looking for input, and maybe hasn't had a lot of godly input in your life, Bill Gothard's IBLP, the Basic Life Principles, and fundamentalist churches, they look like a really good place, especially because they're basically capitalizing on the promise that there is such a thing as happy angel children. They exist, which is, I think, how Tia Levings put it, but they exist, and this is how you can do it. And she was saying, as a young wife, she's seeing these families from IBLP who believe in IBLP stuff and who are homeschooling, doing all these things, and their children sit quietly in a row, 10 kids quietly in a row, well controlled, and not being disruptive at all, and they're perfect. And so of course, who wouldn't want that? Except you don't realize that what's happened is the spirit's been beaten out of them, and therefore they are perfect robots, basically, because that's all they're allowed to be. And I remember an experience like this happening to my husband and I when we were young in the church that we were a part of, which was not at all connected with fundamentalist, they were fundamentalists, but not at all connected with Bill Gothard or with the IBLP. But I remember we visited one of the churches connected to the group that we were a part of, and we met a family who I found out later had been reading Mike and Debbie Pearl's book, To Train Up a Child, but their kids did just that. They sat quietly in church. They didn't need anything to entertain them. They sat there with no coloring books. No, they weren't even allowed to have coloring books and crayons. And when we asked the parents, how did you do that? It was just, we've trained them to sit quietly, and dad, helps with the training a little bit, but mom is basically on with it too. And we just train them to do that without the recognition that, oh my goodness, these kids have no free will. It's been taken from them, and they don't even know how to think outside of that box. And I remember a few years later, we only had 3 children at the time, and they were all very young. I think they were all under 5 at the time when we met this family. And so we were still very much in the beginning stages of parenting and not recognizing. And we didn't have any other young families at our local church gathering. We were in a church gathering where our kids were the youngest, and the next ones in age were 4 or 5 years older already, so into preteens and teen years. And so we had nothing to compare it with. We had nothing to compare our kids to and say, oh, that's normal childhood behavior, as opposed to, no, that's something you should train. And we had a church full of older people, which, hindsight, of course, that should have been a really big flag, because if there's only older people there, they obviously don't know how to connect with the younger generation. And so maybe it's because the younger generation isn't safe there, but that wasn't obvious to me at the time. So I'm just pointing that out, that it was something that would have been a red flag now. And I'm not blaming churches that are old. That's not my point. My point is, if that is a thing that has been going on for a long time, then it's probably because they're not catering to families, and they are not wanting young families to become a part of things. They're very comfortable with the way they are, which is fine if that's okay with you. It's not okay with me as a parent of young children. But anyway, so we thought these kids were great, and they didn't argue with each other. They were just sweet, and they always said yes, Dad, and no, Dad. And any small infraction, they would be escorted to a private place for discipline. And we didn't recognize that that was not a good thing. And I remember us, when our firstborn became about 2.5, and we hadn't spanked her up to that point, other than I think I might have smacked her hand a few times if she went to like touch a hot stove or something where an immediate small pain is meant to, you know, convey that this is going to be a big pain if you continue. But like, we weren't doing spankings. And when we hit 2.5, and suddenly it felt like we didn't know how to control this child, who turns out is neurodivergent, so is simply more intense than most children anyway, has much more intense emotions and swings of emotion, especially at that age. We didn't recognize that that was normal for a child, that the not being able to sit still. And even though she was a little more so than maybe a standard child, certainly not out of the range of what's normal for children. The problem was we were in a place that didn't know what normal for children looked like. So here we got these resources that promised to help us have our kids be perfect. And it seemed appealing. And in the absence of other families who we could learn from, who were in the throes of it, in the absence of real community, there was an appeal there. And we have a lot of regrets for that time with the way we handled things with our kids, and we've had to work through a lot of conversations with our kids. And we did do spankings for a time, because that's what we had been taught was the way to handle children, and that this was how you raised godly kids, was by spanking them. And we very much regret that now and have made a full turnaround on that. But that doesn't take away the damage that was done by that kind of thing. And I think it's so important to recognize that people don't think they're going into a cult. They see the community. They see the guidance for the vision that they have. And they don't recognize that that's a fabricated, fake community that's been created. It's based on control. It's not based on love. And so I thought that was really interesting to see that brought out in episode 2. There was a quote about Bill Gothard that said he turned every family into a cult, and every father into a cult leader, and every family into an island. And the isolation and all the authority and all the power being vested into one person in a family unit, or maybe 1 or 2 people at a local gathering, that is a key point as to the problems with some of the things that we see in this documentary about the IBLP and about Bill Gothard. And it has influenced a lot more Christianity than you might think. My church, I had never heard of Bill Gothard before, and I'd never heard of IBLP until I was well into adulthood, and I think the scandal broke, and that was the first I'd heard of it. First scandal back in 2013, 2014, but I never paid any attention because it wasn't relevant to me, or so I thought. But that's exactly what happens in these families, is the father is the final authority. And if you do something that he doesn't like, you're out from under his authority, and therefore you're not safe. And so if bad things happen, it is entirely your fault. And it's such a setup for grooming. It's such a setup for abuse. There's no concept of bad things happen because we live in a world that's broken. Or we live in a world where evil people exist. The only reason bad things happen in IBLP, in this cult mindset, the only reason bad things happen is because a person deserved them. And the irony of this is that Jesus was super clear about this in the Gospels. He specifically said when his disciples asked him about the blind man, what did this man do to be born blind? Jesus said, nothing. He wasn't born blind because his parents sinned or because he sinned or because anybody sinned. It had nothing to do with that. It was solely so that God's glory could be shown in this man. And yet so many cult groups, including the one I was a part of for a really long time, the Plymouth Brethren, so many of them, they would not say this. You have to understand, none of this is said directly. It's understood as the teachings are put out in Bible studies, in preaching, in personal conversations. This is an understood thing, that bad things don't happen to you if you are doing the right thing, which is bogus. Jesus never promised that. He actually said the opposite. So it's just a really scary scenario. And then if your father is the authority, what he says goes in every area. And because, like he said, that your family becomes an island, it's this little unit, and enmeshment is huge. You can't make basic decisions about your life, about what you wear, even about what you want. If you think something different than what the family says you should be thinking, and you express it in any way, even just by a facial expression, you're gonna hear about it. And I've lived in family like this, and it took me years to recognize that it's just about control. There's no freedom. Again, it says right in the New Testament that it's for freedom Christ has made you free. And so if all these rules are necessary to be good Christians, you're not free. And yet so many people fail to see that disconnect. I failed to see it for a really long time. And it's this concept of cognitive dissonance, where two things actually don't make sense together, but you're so convinced that they're supposed to make sense that you make them make sense. And I'm laughing because it's not really funny, but it is kind of funny, because when you get out of it and you look at it, you're like, oh, yeah, they didn't go together because they weren't supposed to. But it's not obvious when you're in it, because everyone around you is telling you it's supposed to. That you're the one at fault. It's not the fault of the thing that's being said. It's because you must not be doing it right. You're messing things up somehow. And if you're always, somebody else said this in episode 2, and I loved it. It was so right, because they were saying, you're so worried about doing it right and getting it right, you don't have any time to think about maybe what I'm trying to do actually isn't right, and that's why it's not working. And if you're so busy, they call it cannibalizing on your self-worth, I think is how they put it. It was really great. I'll have to look it up and print it on here. But anyway, they made this point that you're spending so much time, you're told that you are the issue. It's all about you and how you're doing things. And first of all, what does that do with grace? There's no such thing as grace if you have to do something. That's the opposite of grace. But if you are so busy focusing on what you must be doing wrong, or whether you're doing it right, wondering if you're doing it right, you don't have any energy left to wonder whether maybe the system is actually the problem. And maybe it doesn't work because it can't work, because it's not supposed to work. But you're just so busy, figuring out how to do it right and trying to remember all the rules. And the other thing is, then if something doesn't go right, there's always something to blame. And this is, I think, a huge thing that we miss, is if you have so many rules that you can't remember that you are supposed to be doing, there's always something to blame if something goes wrong. There's always something you could have done better, instead of recognizing that maybe it had nothing to do with you at all. And we face this, and I'll talk about later in another episode where they talk about Gothard's Matthew 18 philosophy about how you had to have approached things the correct way. But the crack up is, you can never approach things the right way if there's a conflict, because the fact that there is a conflict is the problem. It's automatically the fault of the person who sees the conflict. And you can hear this all throughout the episodes. In the first episode, they talk about how kids are supposed to be getting along. They're perfectly happy. They're quiet. They don't argue, and the parents are never heated or upset. The parents are just going along happily. There's no conflict, is completely avoided. So if there's conflict, it must be the problem of the person who says there's a problem. It's not about doing it right. It's about there's a problem because you're saying there's a problem. Like, you are the problem because you're saying there's a problem. This weird circular thinking. And you don't realize how much that's the case. And it took me actually having to walk through each of those steps in my mind. And I still have to do it sometimes, walking through each of those steps in my mind of how Matthew 18 talks about the steps for conflict resolution. And one of the things that is the strongest for me to remember how I got to where I did with the church I was a part of was that I could point out exactly where I had followed each and every one of those steps in Matthew 18. I had talked to people individually. I had gone to them again with another person. And then I brought it up with elders. And even though we had done all the steps, nothing changed because there's no adherence to that. That's only for the people underneath us. And it's only for us at the top to say that, oh, it's been done right or wrong. So you can't ever win. And of course, you're not designed to win because you're not the authority. The dad's the authority. And that doesn't end at a certain age. It doesn't even end when you're married. Theoretically, it's supposed to end when you're married. But in reality, that's not actually what happens. The only way his authority over you ends is if you find a way to be far enough away that you can maybe get away with things that they don't see. So it's a crock all the way through.